Thank you, everybody. How's everyone doing out there? Good. Hey there. So a little introduction. Also, I'm going to do my best not to slip and fall and completely embarrass myself up here, but if I do, just laugh. It'll be fine. I'll be okay eventually. My name is Ryan Melton, 37-year-old father of two boys, Nigel, age 16, Lincoln, age 3, live in Nevada, Iowa. Run a team of 19 people at Nationwide in Des Moines, but work from home in Story County. Originally from Omaha, Nebraska. Yes, I'm a Nebraska. Yes, I'm a Nebraska Cornhusker fan, but really you should just feel sorry for me. Has not been going well. But this year's our year, I think. Probably not. It might be. Yes. But I've been in Central Iowa for over 2 decades now. I went to Iowa State. Earned my bachelor's in history and political science, and then earned my master's in U.S. history at Kansas University. There we go. But as far as why I decided to run, J.D. Scholten has ran in the last 2 cycles in this race, and decided mid last year he was going to go for a 3rd time. And so initially, my interest was more about who was going to run next, not thinking it would be me. But by January of this year, it became clear that there was a real risk there wasn't going to be a Democrat fighting the good fight in the district. And so even though my life is not built for this, and even though I never planned to do this, it felt like the right thing to do. And so I'm happy to fight for the people. But beyond that, to me, I've been asked to run for public office from time to time, but with my full-time job, my wife and 2 kids, I've always had compelling reasons to say no. But in addition to making sure that the voters had choice this year in the 4th District, I also was really animated by what happened on January 6th. Having a master's in history, I could talk to you all day, every day about the importance of our representative democracy when it comes to fighting the good fight for the people. And I'm not naive enough to think that representative democracy is flawless, right? We have a lot of things to fix about it, no doubt about it. But I'd rather have our current makeup than the alternatives that are out there. But my race through that prism of January 6th is really amplified by the fact that we, in our 4th District, are represented by someone who doesn't recognize the urgency that what happened that day represents when it comes to the well-being of our democratic institutions. So he was asked a couple days after that day what his thoughts were as to the people that stormed the Capitol, and he said they were just wonderful people that got carried away. He voted against the Trump impeachment, and he voted against the creation of the January 6th committee. Since then, it's become quite clear the former president's direct involvement in what happened that day, but my opponent has still not refused or rescinded or revoked the endorsement he received from Donald Trump early June of this year. And in my opinion, an acceptance of Donald Trump's endorsement is a rejection of American democracy. Now, beyond that, being the one pro-democracy candidate in this race, because I am the only one, obviously I'm running this race through what our needs are here not here necessarily, but in the 4th District, not too far away. To me, I really think the root cause to a lot of our worries, both short-term, mid-term, and long-term in the 4th District, which are worries that are quite similar in much of rural America, are the massive population declines that my district has been seeing for decades now. And the reason why population decline is so important to worry about is because if you're losing population base, it leaves your hospitals, businesses, schools, and community much more vulnerable. The good news is that we know what the root causes of those population declines are. We know what things are driving our young people out of the district. So let's go through those, right? So let's start with affordable and accessible childcare and healthcare, right? So there are hundreds of thousands of Iowans right now that live in childcare deserts, that find it incredibly difficult to find affordable and accessible childcare that's stable. And if you're a young person trying to determine if you want to build your family here, you need to have reliable childcare. And we don't have that in so many of our communities. Congressman Feenstra, my opponent, and Governor Reynolds are big fans of regressive tax policies that the experts in childcare tell us every day are making it harder for us to solve these problems. So we need to push back on that kind of thinking. Beyond that, we have a Republican-controlled state legislature in Des Moines, and their answer to the child care crisis is more deregulation. Having younger people watch kids unsupervised and raising the cap on the number of kids each child care worker can watch. It's the last thing we need when we have a child care worker retention crisis in our state. They're already overworked and underpaid. That's the last thing we should be doing to them. And then healthcare. Rural hospitals across the state are facing immense pressure. It is harder and harder for them to keep their doors open. That's why I'm a big believer in a single-payer universal healthcare plan, like Medicare for All, because it's going to make that all of the administrative, bureaucratic red tape much easier to manage for our doctors and hospital administrators. And it's going to increase access for our people that need that support. Beyond that, if you check off those boxes, if you're a young person deciding whether or not you want to build your family here and you have those two things stored away, there's a lot more you have to worry about. You have to find a job. And it was really jarring to me as I was driving throughout the 4th District how many very successful corporations are still posting job wanted ads for $10 an hour. Considering the child care crisis we have, there are plenty of homes in our district and throughout the state where you're probably going to have only one worker because the other person has to stay home and watch the kids. Common Good Iowa has found, depending upon the county you look at in the state, that if you have a 2-parent home with 1 kid at home, the living wage to pay for basic expenses is in the low 20s. And if your options are full-time jobs that pay you half that, and you can't find child care so that both parents can work, that's going to put you in a really tough spot. And that's another disincentive that's driving young people away. Beyond that, though, I'm endorsed by the AFL-CIO. I want to do my part to move the minimum wage closer to a living wage. And I want to bring back collective bargaining rights in a more robust fashion. If you look through this historically, when we saw the attacks on unionization and on collective bargaining decades ago, that's when wage stagnation began, right? There's a direct correlation there. My opponent is literally one of the lowest rated members in Congress by the AFL-CIO for his anti-worker voting record. So if you're a young person and you clear the initial hurdles that the governor and your representative in Congress are doing nothing to help mitigate, you then think, it's going to be harder for me to build a career here, and I've got a representative in Congress that's not looking out for me in the workplace. Another disincentive that's driving our young people away. Let's say you find the job, you then got to find a house. And we're seeing rents go up, we're seeing homeownership costs go up, we're seeing our first-time college graduates already bearing a massive college debt, being priced out of homeownership. And we know that one of the most important things you need to do to build financial strength over time is own your own home. And more young people, recent college graduates and high school graduates, are finding it harder to get those homes. I have rejected corporate PAC money since day one. My opponent feasts on corporate PAC money. My opponent is not the answer to this problem. We have so many corporations buying out properties, flipping them to high rental properties. Unsustainable. So I'm going to do my part to push back there. Let's say you overcome that obstacle. Well, then, a few years down the road, your kids are going to start going to school. Right now, we have a public education crisis in our state. My opponent wants to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. Governor Reynolds recently signed a flat tax bill. Again, experts in public education tell us that if you do that, you hamstring our ability to properly fund our schools. And we've already seen the impacts. We've been underfunding our public schools for years now, and we were once number one in public education in the country. We're now in the middle of the pack. And I don't know if we're at the floor yet. What's really amplifying that issue is you have a governor that's going across the state trying to convince us that in some way it makes sense that we should pull public money out of public schools to fund private school vouchers. We already know what happens when the school in your community closes. What happens is school consolidation, and then you have to put your kid on a school bus for 30, 45, 60, 70 minutes a day in the other town. Why would a young person, when they're deciding where they're going to build their family, want to put their kid through that? That's yet another disincentive. Beyond that, the NEA released their annual State of Affairs for public education and found that over 50% of our public educators are considering leaving early. Underpay is one of the reasons, and Iowa, unfortunately, is notoriously low in starting teacher pay. But the second reason that was cited is the vilification they're getting from politicians. We need to be respecting our public school teachers and giving them the pay, the independence to do what they do best. Now, a bit about my story. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. I grew up in poverty. I didn't have a single person in my immediate family that had graduated from college. And in my family orbit, no one was talking to me about it because no one ever went. No one knew much about it. I had one public school teacher that saw the potential that I had and took a lot of her extra time to build a future for me that included college as a reasonable option. If it wasn't for that one public school teacher, I would not have gone to college, and I certainly wouldn't be here right now, okay? The problem is we have so many kids that are going to school hungry. They're going to school dealing with problems at home. They're certainly not going to school often in an ideal learning mindset. So we need teachers that are robustly paid and respected and not overworked so they can observe these kinds of gaps and they can have the energy they need to lift people up, because a lot of times the only person that's going to educate our kids about a future, including college and other options, is a public school teacher. But if we're underpaying them and overworking them, they're going to miss those opportunities all the time. So I'm going to be the robust defender of public education and public school teachers in this race. But let's say, as a young person, deciding where you're going to build your family here, that you clear all those hurdles. Again, getting no help from your governor and no help from your representative. It's a rather long list of disincentives right now, but things we can fix. There's reason to be optimistic because we know what the problems are, right? But let's say you clear all those hurdles. Well, this then leads us to our next worry, which is we as people deserve to live in communities where we feel safe, secure, respected, and not threatened. And when you dig into Congressman Feenstra's voting record here, it is really amplified that Congressman Feenstra's voting record is Steve King's voting record. They are the exact same voting record. The only difference is Congressman Feenstra doesn't say the worst stuff out loud, but his voting record speaks for him. So that doesn't even matter. So let's dig into that. Pretty much any group of people you look at in my district and 4th District are less safe now having Congressman Feenstra represent them. Let's go through it. For people of color who face discrimination in the workplace, Congressman Feenstra voted against the Crown Act. He voted against the removal of Confederate statues from the Capitol grounds. For people in the LGBTQ+ community, he voted against the Equality Act, which would help us fight back against discrimination they face, and there is a lot of that right now. Congressman Feenstra had the opportunity to codify same-sex marriage, to codify marriage equality. He voted against that, right? With the downfall of Roe, he has not shown 1 ounce of empathy for the fact that pregnant people in our district now live in a much scarier world, right? And look, I've talked to plenty of people that would consider themselves to be pro-life who say Congressman Feenstra's stance is extreme. He's now pushing for a federal abortion ban with no exceptions, right? And people in our district, especially our young people, are really frightened about what a post-Roe world looks like, amplified by a federal abortion ban with no exception. I have literally had numerous young people come up to me and tell me they are so frightened about this that they have made a plan to never get pregnant because they are so afraid of what that post-Roe federal abortion ban world looks like, where they have no reproductive rights and no protections. And pregnancy can be a very traumatic medical experience for people, and it seems like people like Congressman Feenstra are not recognizing that. So I'm going to push back on that. I'm going to push back and make sure we stand up for people's right to choose when it comes to reproductive rights. Now, another population that I really think is rather disrespected because they're used a lot by politicians are veterans. On July 4th, Congressman Feenstra posted on his social media how grateful he was to our veterans, but his voting record does not show gratitude. He voted against the automatic VA sign-up bill. And if you don't know, veterans are often not told when they're in active service of all the benefits they'll be eligible for once they leave the service. So the automatic VA sign-up bill would have helped in that space. He voted against that. He voted against he voted against expanding education benefits for our veterans. But I think the most jarring of them all, I'm sure maybe some of you have heard of the Pact Act, the recent act that expanded healthcare access to up to 3 million soldiers who were victims of toxic burn pit exposure. That bill was first in the U.S. House in March, and Congressman Feenstra voted against it. He went on a radio program and said it cost too much money. It cost too much wait time. What he's acknowledging is that he knows the need is there. But instead of proposing an amendment, if he thought this was indeed a problem, instead of proposing an amendment that would give the VA more tools to be able to absorb that increased ask for health care, he just voted against the whole thing. Now, this is my first rodeo in politics, but I shouldn't be this surprised by the fact that the second time that bill came up in the House for a simple procedural fix, he voted for it that time, and then he bragged about that vote on his House website, as if he didn't vote against it and trashed the bill on radio the first time. Someone on his social media called him out for this. He said, "I've always supported veterans. I voted for the final passage of the bill." So he's not providing his voters context, and so I provided that context for them on his social media. So, but we should not be nickeling and diming our veterans. We should not be using them to cloak ourselves in false patriotism. They give too much for us to be disrespected like that. And gun safety. My 3-year-old is going to preschool starting in a week. An exciting time, but it's tempered because my wife and I literally had to have a conversation about what happens if he goes, but he doesn't come back home safely. Parents and grandparents are having these conversations around gun safety nationwide. Extremely urgent situation. This does not have to be the new norm. But unfortunately, we have so many people in power that want us to think it is the norm and that it has to be that way. Congressman Feenstra has voted against every single gun safety legislation, no matter how common sense it is. He voted against the Charleston loophole, which would have simply expanded the background time from 3 days to 10 for someone who purchased a firearm from a federally licensed gun dealer. What's his rationale for that? Well, he says he doesn't want to inconvenience gun owners. But I've talked to Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, and Independents across the board during this cycle, gun owners in all camps, who all say the same thing. They are okay with being inconvenienced if the inconvenience means their kids are safer. But instead, Congressman Feenstra continues to brag about his A rating from the NRA instead. So I'll close with this. I'll close on climate change, and if we have any more time, I'm happy to answer questions. 2 op-eds illustrate where Congressman Feenstra is on climate change. I think we should trust the science, and the science tells us there is a clear consensus we are living in an existential threat with climate change. And more of our farmers, more and more of our people on the ground are seeing it with the extreme weather events we're having and the impacts that they're seeing when it comes to productivity and long-term sustainability, right? So Congressman Feenstra, 2 op-eds that are really notable here. The further north and west you go, there's a big concern right now with carbon capture pipelines. Not as big of an issue down here in Des Moines, but in my district it's a big concern. Essentially, carbon capture pipelines they're a carbon sequestration technology in which the pipelines are attached to an ethanol refinery plant, for example, and they claim to take off some of the carbon residue to make ethanol cleaner fuel. But if you do the research on this, you do the digging on this, carbon sequestration plants have closed by the multitudes because it's a failed technology. It overpromises and underdelivers. But the big concern, and there's a lot of big concerns about it, is that 3 companies are asking the Iowa Utilities Board here in Des Moines to allow them to use eminent domain to take private landowners' land away to plant these carbon capture pipelines. And we know eminent domain is not intended for that purpose. It's intended for right-of-way utilities and those kinds of things, not to line the pockets of private corporations. But that's what they want the Iowa Utilities Board to do. And Congressman Feenstra, not a surprise considering who bankrolls his campaign, wrote an op-ed in support of these carbon capture pipelines, the same carbon capture pipelines that roughly 80% of polled voters in Northwest Iowa are against because it's common sense. Why would you give the burden of a risk of a carbon capture pipeline leak? Why would you put that burden on us, on our shoulders on the ground, just so corporations can rake in massive profit from that? For a failed technology that is not a legitimate climate change solution. It doesn't make any sense, right? The final thing I'll say on climate change, recent op-ed from Congressman Feenstra, he said, even if those Democrats get their way and every single person's driving an electric vehicle, that electricity grid is fueled on coal and oil anyway. There's no escape from our fossil fuel future. Again, no surprise considering who bankrolls this campaign. If you did a control F on that op-ed, not one single mention of wind and solar energy. And we in this state are one of the most robust producers of wind power in the entire world. Congressman Feenster is not the answer for climate change mitigation either. Time is up. We can talk later. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. I really appreciate you. I'm at meltonforiowa.com, Melton for Iowa and my socials. I'm the politician that cares about the long-term viability and sustainability of our communities. Let's get more people like that in office. Thank you.